So my name is Elsa Wiehe, and I lead the Boston University African Studies Center Education Program. I'm really happy to have the honor to help organize this event tonight. I want to welcome you all very warmly, and all the educators, all the teachers, and we also have some students here with us tonight. So welcome to this, especially to the students. So before we go on to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, Dr. Tounsel, I wanted to say a few brief words about the Boston University African Studies Center. Many of you in the room know, but the Boston University African Studies Center is federally funded. We are a Title VI National Resource Center program. So that means that we have a public mission to serve educators across the K-12 spectrum with resources and events related to Africa and African studies. And our goal, our primary goal, and the goal of the program that I run is to support increased knowledge about the continent in schools. I do need to say that since this event tonight is supported in part by the Department of Education Title VI funding, that the content doesn't necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Education, and it's not there, and doesn't necessarily have their endorsement. The event is also supported by the New England History Teachers Association and the Journal of New England History, and my colleague Linda Morse is here to represent these two associations. This leads me to the question, and I wanted to start with a few brief minutes of framing. So why are we here, and why did we decide to do this series? So the Wagner Group, as you all know, made global headlines in recent months after an attempted coup in Russia, and more recently after the alleged assassination of Prigozhin. So this suddenly led the Wagner Group's activities in Africa, in Mali and Libya and Sudan, for example, to be much more globally visible. Of course, the Wagner Group had been operating in places like Syria. So if you've been following politics in Syria, you would know this as well. And while the Wagner Group is one force operating on the continent, there are several others that also include the US military that in this country tend to go unreported and not talked about. And there are currently some really major geopolitical and geoeconomic realignments happening. So we decided that the webinar series would start with the Wagner Group because it is an important force and it's being talked about at the moment, but we will also look at AFRICOM, the French military, particularly in West Africa, and also end with a case study of the US military base on the Chagos Island, which is my country of Mauritius. So I also want to make clear our assumptions in building this webinar is that the underlying goal of this series, I mean, when we talk about the military presence in the continent, we fundamentally believe that talking about military presence on the continent is part of the education work that we need to do for continued decolonization, right? So one core question that to be able to answer every time is what are the cases? How do Africans grapple with these presences? And so tonight we're happy to host Dr. Tounsel, who's going to shed light on the Wagner Group. And I'm now going to turn it to my colleague Linda Morse, who's a Teaching Africa teacher alum and editor of the New England Journal of History, to introduce our speaker. Take it away, Linda.
Hi, thanks, Elsa. I met Dr. Chris Tounsel this summer when we were doing a workshop on religious nationalism in Harvard. And he spoke so deeply and passionately about the history and experiences of people in Sudan, and spoke on religious nationalism and all the dimensions that are involved with religious nationalism, race and gender and tribalism and all kinds of sections of what's going on, that I thought when we were discussing having a program on what we're doing tonight, that he would be such a wonderful speaker. So Dr. Chris Tounsel is an associate professor of history and director of the American Studies program at the University of Washington, an historian of modern Sudan. His book, Chosen Peoples, Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, was published by Duke University Press in 2021. Chosen Peoples was named a finalist for the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora's Outstanding First Book Award and was a finalist for Christianity Today's Book Award. In addition to his historical research, Dr. Tounsel has provided commentary on Sudanese and South Sudanese affairs for venues including BBC World Service Radio, Al Jazeera English, and South Sudan's UN Radio Mariah. So I'm so excited that Dr. Tounsel has agreed to share his insights with us about the Wagner Group and many of the countries that are affected right now. And I hope everybody welcomes him tonight. So thank you.
So thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Linda. I am going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint, and I will be very cognizant of the time. I am currently in Metro Seattle, so it is a little after 5 p.m. my time, but I get that you all are 3 hours ahead. So I will make sure to respect the time and make sure that there is plenty of space for Q&A. So the title of my presentation today is Understanding the Wagner Group, and we can just jump right in. So what exactly is the Wagner Group, right? Well, we'll begin with the kind of very 30,000 feet description, right? Generally speaking, the Wagner Group is a Russian private military company that is unofficially linked, right? Key, unofficially linked to the Russian government. Pictured here in the top center is its former and recently deceased leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who during his lifetime was chiefly concerned with providing Moscow with a cheap and deniable foreign policy tool while also generating a profit, right? And so what the Wagner Group does is it helps to secure huge investments, intervenes in crisis hotspots, and effectively functions as an unofficial Kremlin foreign policy auxiliary group, right? And during President Vladimir Putin's reign, Russian private military companies like the Wagner Group have been a part of the nation's foreign policy. It's a relatively young group, right? It bursts onto the international scene only in 2014. Following Russia's invasion of the Crimea, which is in eastern Ukraine. And it is an international operation, right? Wagner has offices in Argentina and Hong Kong, right? And obviously in Russia itself. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the group has sought to build relationships with states that are both resource rich, but administratively weak, right? And the services it provides includes combat, intelligence, and spreading information in exchange for financial profit through mining concessions. Now, in terms of the geopolitical context, right, in which Wagner is operating within sub-Saharan Africa, right? Kind of the elephant in the room question, right? Why would Wagner pursue Russian interests in a continent that shares no geographical borders with Russia itself, right? It never colonized Africa like, Portugal, France, and England, right? But be that as it may, we know that Russian interest in Africa goes all the way back to the Cold War, and really to the earliest days of the Cold War. So in the mid-20th century, we know that Russia supported African liberation movements and exported arms and ammunition, and that though such Russian support decreased after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Vladimir Putin has tried to revive these kind of historically rooted connection and serve as another option to Western policies, right? And while I don't have a map pictured here, if you can imagine the map of Africa, right, we know that Russia really wants to strengthen its position in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? It wants to acquire ports on the Red Sea. So, of course, the Red Sea being the kind of dividing body of water between the Sudan to the west and Saudi Arabia to the east. It also wants to kind of leverage its position in North Africa, right, which is obviously the southern frontier of several NATO countries, right? And so Africa has this really kind of interesting geopolitical importance for Russia, right? Now, what do African nations stand to benefit from Russia? Well, interestingly enough, many African nations depend on imported wheat and other grains from Russia and the Ukraine. And in addition to foodstuffs, we know that as of last year, Russia was exporting more weapons to Africa than any other non-African country, right? So many African countries get food and weaponry from Russia, right? And Africa is also vital to Russia's NATO antagonists in the West, right? Countries like England and France, right? France, it has been estimated that 75% of French light bulbs use uranium from Niger, right? West African country. We know that Nigeria is a huge producer of gas, right, for continental Europe, right? And so there's a way in which the continent of Africa is not only vital to Russia, but is also vital to many countries in the West, including countries like the US and former colonial powers, France and the UK, right? And so in this way, Wagner's presence in sub-Saharan Africa is a kind of destabilizing force, right? It is this kind of X factor that seeks to undermine traditional alliances, right? That France, for one, has had with countries like Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, right? As well as the US, right? The US having partnered with many countries in Western Africa in the kind of, quote unquote, war on terror, right? Confronting organizations like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIS. Now, given the overwhelming attention that the Wagner Group has received in recent months, right, it may come as a surprise to many Americans to learn that it is only one of many mercenary groups operating in Africa, right? And when I use this term mercenary, of course, I'm using the kind of, layperson's term for a hired gun, right? And certainly mercenaries have a very long history in the world, going back to the Greco-Roman period. There's even mercenaries mentioned in the Bible, right? So not an entirely new phenomenon, but one that has seen a resurgence in recent years in Africa, right? And in recent African history, about the last 50 years or so, mercenaries have operated on the continent for the purposes of protecting incumbent leaders on the one hand, or to install new ones on the other. And within an African geopolitical context that has seen increased deployments of private foreign military companies, it has been estimated that Wagner has been joined not only by private entities from Europe, but also from private military companies in the US, right? We know that Mozambique, for example, has hired the South African-based DAG, which is a security firm, to fight Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab being a extremist group kind of headquartered in the Horn of Africa. The German private security company Ashgard has operated in countries that include Sudan, Libya, Mauritania, and Egypt. French and British companies have also been active on the continent. And not to be outdone, US companies CACI and Academy have been described as being among the most prominent private military companies on the continent aside from Wagner, right? CAIC is headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, and is actually traded publicly on the New York Stock Exchange, while Academy, which was founded by a former Navy SEAL by the name of Eric Prince, has provided services for both the Central Intelligence Agency and the US State Department. So all of that is just to say that while the Wagner Group is obviously very important as, a particular mercenary group, it is far from the only mercenary group operating in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? Next slide. There we go. So where has Wagner operated thus far that we know of, right? Well, from Libya to the north to Mozambique to kind of the extreme southeast, we know that Wagner has operated in a wide swath of African countries. In the North African country of Libya, the UN has reported that Wagner supervised nearly 1,000 private military contractors. And while Moscow does not officially recognize this, it does not recognize it, which basically allows it to deny culpability, right? While at the same time maintaining a very real presence, right, on, again, the south shore of the Mediterranean Sea, right across from NATO countries like Greece and Italy, right? In Mali, to the southwest, well, the far southwest of Libya, Russia has supported coup leader and now interim president Assimi Goïta. In 2018, Mali appealed to Russia to assist in its fight against the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and the government hired Wagner in early 2021, right? And although Wagner was brought in for the purposes of fighting extremism, we know that it has also provided security and trained local forces. And in return, Wagner has procured access to Mali's very rich natural resources, including gold mines to the tune of $10 million concessions a year, right? And so, that has been its experience in Mali, but I will return to the human rights abuses that Wagner has been accused of in Mali shortly. But now going to the southeast in the Central African Republic, we know that there, which is a very gold and diamond-rich country, Wagner began supporting its government's fight against rebel groups. And in return, Russian advisors have increased their potential influence on economic and political matters. At one point, as many as 2,500 Wagner personnel were stationed in the Central African Republic, and Wagner obtained control of a gold mine that was predicted to generate as much as $1 billion in profit, right? So we're talking about operations that, 2,500 people might on the surface sound small, but when we think about the economic profit that is being generated, this is a major, major investment, right? However, it's important to note that in terms of Wagner's imprint in the Central African Republic, that it has significantly gone down in the wake of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So you have had some Wagner personnel who were in the Central African Republic redeployed to the Ukraine. And then further south in gas-rich Mozambique, Wagner has supported government forces against rebels in the northern part of that country, right? And that in September 2019, right, just a few months before the COVID outbreak, Mozambique signed agreements with Russia concerning defense, energy, and mineral resources. And in addition to Libya, Mali, the Central African Republic, and Mozambique, we know that the Kremlin and/or Wagner has made its impact in other countries as well, right? Two of Africa's most populous countries, Nigeria and Ethiopia, each signed military cooperation agreements with the Kremlin in 2021. Uganda, Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Burkina Faso have all purchased weapons from Russia. And soldiers behind the recent coups in Chad, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau have received military training sponsored by Russia, right? So in no ways should Russia's relationship with Africa be seen as one that is exclusively tied to the Wagner Group, right? Wagner is a piece, but not the entirety of the relationship. Now, all of these aforementioned national examples notwithstanding, right, I can say as an historian of the Sudan that my kind of first and primary exposure to Wagner activity in Africa has been through the particular context of the Sudan, right? This country, and I'll just go back briefly, Sudan being kind of south of Egypt, right? East of Chad, this very kind of interesting nexus on the continent between North and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn of Africa, right? So Russia has historic links with the Sudanese army, and again, for a long time has been trying to gain a naval port positioning in the Red Sea, right? And as you can imagine, if Russia were able to build a fully operational base at the Red Sea, it would then have very much of a potentially destabilizing influence on the global trade that goes through the Red Sea up into the Mediterranean and/or the other way into the Indian Ocean, right? We know that over 12% of all global trade that travels on water goes through the Red Sea. So Russia is very interested in being able to have a naval presence on that body of water, right? Hence its fascination with the Sudan, right? And while much of the international community shunned and sanctioned Russia after its Ukraine invasion, Sudan actually provided Moscow with an economic lifeline through its gold reserves, right? And Russia's interest in Sudanese gold dates back to at least 2017, when after a meeting between then Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, and Vladimir Putin, the two countries established what is known as the Maori Gold Corporation, which is in effect a Wagner Group subsidiary. Right? Wagner provided then Sudanese President Bashir with security and logistical support, while Russian business received diamond mining concessions in return. And since the 2019 coup that removed Bashir from power, Moscow has aligned itself with Mohammed Hameti Dagalo, who is the leader of Sudan's paramilitary force known as the Rapid Support Forces, right? Hameti, right, this Sudanese warlord kind of in cahoots with Wagner at this point, has sought to control more and more of Sudan's gold mines And as recently as last year, we know that Sudanese sources told CNN that at least 16 Russian gold smuggling flights had embarked from Sudan in the previous 18 months. And so Wagner's involvement in Sudanese gold extraction and its role in supplying fighters in the Ukraine have prompted many observers to suggest that Sudanese gold is being used to finance Moscow's war, right? And according to US officials, Wagner has offered weaponry, including surface-to-air missiles, to Hemeti. And this is particularly important because the RSF might be a very powerful paramilitary group, but it lacks an air force. And so having surface-to-air missiles helps to kind of account for the fact that it does not have an air force, right? Now, Wagner's consequences, right? While Wagner has operated in a variety of geographic locales across Africa, this diversity of locales is contrasted with its uniformly negative impact that Wagner has had with respect to human rights, right? Wagner has been linked to a long history of human rights abuses. We know that in Mali, for example, violence against civilians increased following Wagner's arrival in that country in late 2021. And in March 2022, the organization played a role in the massacre of hundreds of Malian civilians, which sparked UN experts to call for an investigation. Further south in the gold and diamond-rich Central African Republic, one UN document has posited that Wagner has committed human rights violations against civilians in that country as well, including sexual assaults in villages that are near Wagner bases. And Wagner personnel have also been linked to crimes against civilians in the Sudan, right? And yet, right, it's really important to note again that just as Wagner is not the only foreign military company operating in Africa, it is not alone in its connections to human rights abuses, right? The Group for Research and Information on Peace and Security has reported that private military and security companies, including those from the West, have also disregarded human rights. And the UN reported that the South African-based DAG, for one, indiscriminately killed civilians in June 2020, right? So there's a way in which attention should absolutely be paid on Wagner with respect to its human rights abuses. But just like Wagner is not the only foreign mercenary group operating in Africa, it is also not alone in its complicity, right, of human rights abuses in Africa. So last but not least, before the Q&A, right, there's the kind of most general question, right, for us in this Zoom room today, right, teaching predominantly in a US-based context. Why should we know about the Wagner Group, right? Why should, whether we are teaching sixth graders or juniors in college, right? Why should our students know about this military activity? Well, perhaps the most prosaic reason is the fact that Russia's Ukraine offensive, which is obviously the story that has dominated global headlines for the last year plus, is still ongoing. And Wagner, which is so crucial to Russia's war machine, is not going anywhere. Right? And following Wagner's short-lived rebellion earlier this year, right, and the untimely, fiery demise of Wagner leader, Wagner leader Prigozhin, right? Russia's foreign minister still announced that Wagner's operations in Africa would continue, right? And while some of Russia's client governments in Africa were concerned after Prigozhin's death, one advisor to the Central African Republic's president informed the media that Prigozhin's death would not change its relationship with Russia, right? But aside from the contemporary, quote unquote, current events piece that should compel us as teachers to know about this military activity, I believe that there are a multitude of other reasons why we should continue to be aware as we prepare to engage with our students. And in the interest of time, I'll just offer these three for now, but again, I'd be happy during the Q&A to offer and entertain some other reasons. First, I think that teachers should be aware about Wagner activity in Africa because African peoples, affairs, and resources are going to have an ever-increasing role in our students' lives. Russia, China, France, Turkey, Japan, Britain, and the United States have each hosted their own gatherings focused on Africa. And just 2 months ago, Joseph Sani, who is affiliated with the U.S. Institute of Peace, provided this following statement to a U.S. House Congressional Subcommittee, quote, "It's worth asking why Americans should care about competing in Africa or investing in its stability. The answer is clear," he says. "Africa is poised to shape the 21st century as the world's fastest growing demographic and economic power," end quote. And I have found that there are several indicators, right, that bear this out. Not limited, but including the facts that one, it is predicted that a quarter, right, a full 25% of the world's population will be African by the year 2050, right? So while many of our students that we're teaching today are kind of entering, we'll just say their 40s and 50s, right? That 1 in 4 people on Earth will be on the continent of Africa, right? And that this number actually balloons to 1/3 by the year 2100. Also, Africa remains rich in minerals that are used to make mobile phones and solar panels. And thus, Africa will be central to the future of telecommunications and renewable energy. And China is currently Africa's largest trading partner, with a total value of $254 billion just in 2021, right? And for those of you who are thinking, well, what does that compare to US-Africa trade? That's 4 times the amount that the US trades with Africa. Right? And so as Africa becomes more central to global demographics and trade, we as teachers owe it to our students to expose them to contemporary African affairs that includes the work of organizations like Wagner. Right? Even a basic understanding of African politics and history will be important for anyone looking to be an informed and engaged citizen. The second reason why I think teachers should know about ongoing Wagner operations in Africa is Africans' positionality in the war on terror. Right? Last Monday, of course, marked the 22nd anniversary of the September 11, 2001 attacks that catapulted the US into its lengthy wars against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. And while the US withdrew its forces from Iraq in 2011 and Afghanistan last August, we know that the fight against terrorist extremism continues in Africa, where organizations like ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab have operated. And it's against this backdrop that Russian and Wagner operations in Africa throw a disturbing wrench into the situation, right? And one need not look any further than the Sudan, right? Where America's strategic interest in the ongoing Sudanese crisis can be considered through the lens of its opposition to Russia's war in Ukraine and concern over the spread of instability, right? In recent years, the US has benefited from a warming relationship with Sudan's leaders, especially in its cooperation against terrorism, right? And so the Biden administration will be fearful of Sudan's instability, providing the kinds of conditions in which terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab may thrive. And the same can be said of Mali, where the Islamic State, or ISIL, has doubled its territory just in the past year alone. And then last but not least, I think that mercenary activity in Africa and beyond should push teachers and students alike to re-examine the ways that we understand the nature of war itself, right? If you're like me, I emerged from my K through 12 education with the traditional understanding that war consists of two or more nation states conducting massive and formal military operations against one another. And this was no doubt reinforced by repeated occasions of textbooks and teachers presenting me with examples like the American Revolution, the Civil Wars, World War II, and so on and so forth. And while it is, of course, important for current and future generations to be knowledgeable about the causes, conduct, and consequences of these conflicts, perhaps it is high time for us as teachers to educate students about past and present mercenary activity. Between 2009 and 2016 alone, the ratio of US soldiers to private contractors in Afghanistan tripled. And by 2020, the Pentagon was spending more than $370 billion, billion with a B, on private military contractors. As America's role on the world stage continues to be debated, how do we help our students come to terms with military operations that are increasingly outsourced, quote unquote, unofficial, and or conducted in ways that bypass international law? What does it mean to outsource the defense of American values? And so, notwithstanding the particular significance of Wagner activity in Africa, we should not ignore the reality of America's own use of private military companies in Africa and beyond. So thank you for your time. This is the very long list of sources that I use to construct this talk, and that I invite you to check out on your own time. And I look forward to answering your questions. So I'll stop my screen share, and yeah, thank you for your time.